Tonight, the Colorado massacre suspect in court. James Holmes appeared dazed and was prevented from speaking by his own attorney. Barry Peterson was in the courtroom. John Miller is on the investigation. Penn State is hit with crippling penalties, and Joe Paterno is wiped out of the record books. Armen Keteyian on the fallout from the child sex abuse scandal.
Sports themselves can become too big to fail. In the Penn State case, the results were perverse and unconscionable.
A pioneer has died. Sally Ride, the first American woman in space. And John Blackstone on the survivors of the Aurora massacre fighting for their lives.
He needs to get better because he needs to be a dad.
This is the CBS Evening News with Scott Pelley.
Good evening. It was a strange and jarring picture. We got our first look today at the man accused of the worst mass shooting in U.S. history, the movie theater massacre in Aurora, Colorado. 24-year-old James Holmes made his first court appearance, but from the looks of him, it wasn't entirely clear that he knew he was there. Sitting next to one of his attorneys, his orange hair made him look like a character from the Batman movies. As the judge spoke, Holmes didn't seem to make eye contact. In fact, he didn't seem to follow the conversation at all. We have a team of correspondents covering this story. Barry Peterson was in the courtroom with Holmes. And Barry, how did he seem in person?
Well, I have to say, Scott, it was really sort of eerie to be there. He seemed so uninvolved. It was almost chilling because we're talking about the fate of his life. Frankly, I had a hard time taking my eyes off of him. You keep staring at that face, looking for some clue as to why this happened. He, on the other hand, seemed uninterested. And when he was offered a chance to speak, he turned it down.
Mr. Holmes, do you have any questions about that initial advisement?
Judge, we've advised Mr. Holmes thoroughly and made formal or further advisement at this point.
Thank you, Mr. King.
The hearing's purpose was to inform Holmes of charges he will soon face.
You're committed the offense of first-degree murder, which is a Class 1 felony under Colorado law.
The prosecutor will file those charges by next Monday, and the public defender is expected to soon file a motion for a mental health evaluation routine in these cases.
You shall refrain from contacting, directly or indirectly, communicating with the victims.
This is Holmes' mugshot. The 24-year-old suspect is being kept in solitary confinement. Prosecutors say they do not know if he is on medication, which might explain why he looked dazed, at times almost dozing off during the 12-minute hearing. Holmes did not seem to make eye contact with anyone in the room. 5 members of victims' families came to court to see the proceedings, among them Ian Sullivan, the father of 6-year-old Veronica Moser Sullivan, the youngest victim.
In a case like this, the investigation doesn't stop. It will continue up to trial. And so as we find more information, we want to make sure we've got the right charges.
Colorado is a state with the death penalty, and District Attorney Carol Chambers told reporters outside the court that it is being considered in this case, but she will first discuss that with the victims. If you talk to the victims and the mood is not to go for the death penalty, are you bound in some way to follow their wishes?
It will ultimately be the decision of the prosecutors on the case.
This is the beginning of what's going to be a long process, another hearing next week, and the expectation is a trial would not begin until sometime next year. Scott?
Barry, thanks. Holmes' parents issued a statement through their lawyer today. They said that their hearts go out to the victims and their families. The more we see and hear of Holmes, the more questions are raised, and senior correspondent John Miller has been talking to his law enforcement sources about what they're finding out. John, what are they going to do to try to find a motive in this case?
They're looking at 2 or 3 different things. Number one is that computer that they took out yesterday. Of course, they'll go through the papers in the apartment, but they believe the most productive area will be in that computer. Number 2 is looking at relationships. One of the things that they have been looking for is a story, a rumor, if you will, about a girlfriend and a potential breakup that might have happened around the time that he turned towards this. And of course, they're looking at his planning, gun ranges and places he went to see who he spoke to and what he said.
The authorities have said that he spent thousands of dollars over the last many weeks buying ammunition, buying his weapons. What are they trying to piece together with that trail?
Trying to figure out what is that money and where did it come from. That was That was $14,000 over a period of 4 to 6 months that he spent on ammunition, on chemicals, on tactical gear, on weapons, and he's paid $11,000 of that off. Now, source of income, he gets about $1,763 a month from the National Institutes of Health as a PhD candidate in neuroscience, so there might be another source of money, and they're looking at follow the money.
John, thanks very much. In all, 55 people were shot, 12 died, 9 are still in critical condition, fighting to survive. Here's John Blackstone.
Caleb Medley was shot in the eye at the theater and remains heavily sedated in intensive care. In the same hospital, 1 floor away, his wife Katie is about to give birth to their first child. Seth Medley is Caleb's brother.
He's a strong guy. I'm not used to him, not used to seeing him like that. I don't ever want to see him like that again.
But even if Caleb fully recovers, what happened at the midnight movie threatens to ruin the couple financially. His family has been told medical bills could total $2 million. Longtime friend Michael West is trying to raise money.
Caleb, he doesn't have any insurance, so I put together a website.
He's looking forward to being a dad.
We talk to him because we know he can hear us. We tell him that he needs to get better because he needs to be a dad.
Many are struggling with the emotions raised by this tragedy. 13-year-old Kaylin was babysitter for the youngest victim in the shooting, 6-year-old Veronica Moser Sullivan. Veronica's mother, Ashley Moser, is still in the hospital with wounds to her neck and abdomen. Kaylin was in the theater beside them.
Well, I want it just to be a nightmare, just a dream. I don't want this to be real.
When the shooting stopped, Kaylin called 911, then tried to give CPR to Veronica.
It's horrifying, picturing in my head what I saw that night.
A 13-year-old shouldn't have to see this kind of stuff, go through this kind of stuff.
Other people have it much worse than I do. And other people are going through a lot worse than I am.
They don't have to be strong now.
I feel like with everybody who's been injured that I was with, I feel like I should be strong for them. If they break down, I want to be strong and help them.
Kaylin's family says they know she too needs help. And Scott, Kaylin's mother says the 13-year-old will start getting grief counseling this week.
A remarkable young lady. John, thank you very much. The crimes that occurred at Penn State have essentially cost the university its football program today. Not the NCAA's so-called death penalty, which would have shut the program down, but a list of sanctions that may be even worse. The NCAA passed judgment today over the cover-up that allowed an assistant football coach to continue to rape young boys for years. Armin Katayan reports that the sanctions cripple the future of Penn State football and wipe out the glory of its past.
NCAA President Mark Emmert delivered a powerful rebuke to a school that he said valued football above all else.
One of the grave dangers stemming from our love of sports is that the sports themselves can become too big to fail, indeed too big to even challenge. In the Penn State case, the results were perverse and unconscionable.
The sanctions include a record $60 million fine, equal to 1 year's revenues of the football team, a 4-year ban on bowl games, the loss of 40 scholarships over the next 4 years, a devastating blow to a top program like Penn State, 5 years probation, essentially house arrest by the NCAA, and subject to a new academic integrity monitor, and vacating all Penn State wins under former head coach Joe Paterno from 1998 to 2011, stripping away 111 of his wins, meaning the coach caught up in the cover-up will no longer have the most wins in major college football. This came one day after the university removed, under a blue blanket, the iconic statue of Paterno, symbolizing his once exalted stature.
No price the NCAA can levy will repair the grievous damage inflicted by Jerry Sandusky on his victims. However, we can make clear that the culture, actions, and inactions that allowed them to be victimized will not be tolerated in collegiate athletics.
As the sanctions were announced, emotions poured out from inside the university's student union. The Paterno family released a statement that said in part, the sanctions defame the legacy and contributions of a great coach and educator without any input from our family or those who knew him best. This is not a fair or thoughtful action. One of the unprecedented things about these sanctions is they don't involve recruiting violations or cheating. The chairman of the NCAA Executive Committee, Ed Ray, defended the ruling.
Not only does the NCAA have the authority to act in this case, we also have the responsibility to say that such egregious behavior is not only against our bylaws and Constitution, but also against our value system and basic human decency.
There will be no appeal as Penn State has signed a consent decree agreeing to all the penalties. And while the bowl ban will last for 4 years, the overall impact of these penalties, Scott, will haunt the football program and this university for decades.
And Jerry Sandusky was convicted on more than 40 counts of sexual abuse and will be sentenced in the fall. Armin, thank you very much. There has been a terrible accident in Texas involving a single pickup truck. 14 people were killed. It is hard to imagine, but there were 23 people in the truck, mostly illegal immigrants. It appears that a bad tire forced them off the road near San Antonio. The police believe it was a smuggling operation, bringing people up from Mexico. Syria is warning the world that it is prepared to use chemical weapons. A massive fire guts an American nuclear sub, and it was no accident. And Gabrielle Giffords reaches new heights in her recovery when the CBS Evening News continues. The Syrian dictatorship threatened today to use chemical and biological weapons against any aggression from foreign powers. It is the first time that we've heard Syria admit that it has weapons of mass destruction. A Syrian government spokesman drew a line, though, saying that the dictatorship would not use those weapons against Syrian civilians to put down the rebellion against President Bashar al-Assad. President Obama had a warning for Assad today.
Given the regime's stockpiles of chemical weapons, we will continue to make it clear to Assad and those around him that the world is watching and that they will be held accountable by the international community and the United States should they make the tragic mistake of using those weapons.
Syrian rebels fighting the 42-year-old dictatorship have seized the initiative over the last week. A bomb killed Assad's defense minister and 3 other top officials. The rebels held several Syrian border crossings for a time, and now they're closing in on Syria's second most important city, Aleppo. Syria rarely allows reporters in the country. Our Elizabeth Palmer is following events from Lebanon.
The war has now come to Aleppo. Until a few days ago, Syria's biggest city had stayed relatively calm. Not anymore. A major opposition offensive is underway to take this vital commercial hub. Syrian Free Army Colonel Abdel al-Qaidi made the call to arms online. We ordered all our forces, he said, to move towards Aleppo and liberate the city. But so-called liberation comes at a huge cost. Just 30 miles north of Aleppo, in Azaz, rebel fighters are celebrating a hard-won victory. After 100 days of intense fighting, they finally control this town. But many of the buildings are rubble, and most of the residents had to run for their lives. Syrians, both pro and anti-regime, know this now. Whenever the Free Syrian Army digs in, it's time to leave, to escape the lethal clashes that follow with government troops. Wael al-Khaldi is an opposition activist who also works with some of the 30,000 Syrians seeking refuge in Lebanon, including these recent arrivals now living in a school. They fled last week from heavy shelling in Damascus when rebel fighters took over whole neighborhoods, drawing fire from the Syrian army. That, said Khaldi, put innocent lives in a crowded city at risk.
they want to fight, fight and run, no problem. But don't hide behind enemies, behind civilian and or inside of buildings, the civilian. They will bomb it for sure, and you know that.
They, the regime's troops, did bomb it for sure. Hard enough to drive rebel fighters out or into hiding. Tonight, Damascus is back in government hands, at least for now.
Elizabeth Palmer is joining us in Beirut. Elizabeth, from looking at your story and from what we've seen over the last week or so, the tempo of the fighting seems to have increased quite a bit.
Yes, July is on track to be the bloodiest month yet in this conflict. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says that 2,752 people have died so far this month alone, a quarter of them government troops.
And about 19,000 killed, according to the estimates of one authoritative source, in the last 17 months of this uprising. Liz, thank you. It was 2 months ago that a nuclear submarine went up in flames while it was in dry dock in Maine. The fire caused $400 million in damage to the USS Miami. Today, a civilian employee was charged with setting the fire. Naval investigators say the worker has confessed, and he said he did it because he was suffering from anxiety and he wanted to get off work early. She was the first American woman to orbit the Earth. Remembering Sally Ride, next. Sally Ride has died. The cause, pancreatic cancer. She was the first American woman in space, an inspiration to the 42 others who followed her. Here's Seth Doan.
Sally Ride was a physicist when she answered a NASA ad seeking applicants for the space program. In 1983, she became the first American woman in space.
The thing that I'll remember most about that flight is that it was fun, and in fact, I'm sure it's the most fun I'll ever have in my life.
Let me just remind you that when we had lunch here at the White House before your flight, that somebody said that sometimes the best man for a job was a woman. You were there because you were the best person for the job.
She flew again in 1984 and served on a panel investigating the Challenger disaster. Ride inspired countless young women to pursue careers in science. She founded Sally Ride Science, which developed science-themed camps, festivals, and classes for children who dreamed about reaching for the stars.
It's a real experience, and the experience of a lifetime to be able to fly in space and fly aboard the space shuttle. And I have to admit that I'm more excited about that opportunity than I am about being the, as you say, a footnote in history.
Today, President Obama called Sally Ride a national hero and a role model. Ride was 61 years old. Seth Doan, CBS News, New York.
We were struck today by a picture of another inspiring woman, especially after all that's happened in Colorado. That's former Arizona Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords high up in the French Alps. She and her husband, former astronaut Mark Kelly, made the trip using cable cars. This is her first trip outside the U.S. since she was shot in an assassination attempt last year. Amid the tragedy in Aurora, there were extraordinary acts of heroism. That story is next. At the memorial service in Aurora, Colorado last night, the mourners made a solemn vow to never forget those who lost their lives in that movie theater on Friday. It is in that spirit that we asked Lee Cowan to tell us more about them, the men, women, children, and the heroes among them.
Nobody died alone in Aurora that night. The 12 who lost their lives all went to the movies with a relative, a spouse, or a friend. Matt McQuinn dove in front of his girlfriend and her older brother to shield them from the gunfire. They lived, he didn't. John Larimer, a Navy sailor, stood between life and death for his girlfriend too. Air Force Staff Sergeant Jesse Childress saved the life of the fellow airman beside him. And Jonathan Blanc pushed his friend, Jansen Young, to the floor and lay on top of her.
Even after I was thrown under the seats, I kept thinking, this is it, I'm gonna die.
He took the bullet instead of her.
I don't know how to give my life back to someone that's already given their life to me. How do you do that?
Amazing grace.
Stories like these are offering some comfort. Memorials are popping up on street corners and prayer vigils are organized in parks.
We will honor you by celebrating life. We will honor you by living our lives a little better.
Colorado's governor read the names of the dead last night.
Michaela Medic.
Kayla, as her friends called her, was found on the floor of the theater, along with 6-year-old Veronica Moser Sullivan, the youngest of the dead. At 51, Gordon Cowden was the oldest, a single dad. Rebecca Wingo was a single mother. She leaves behind 2 daughters. Alex Sullivan leaves behind a new wife. He died 2 days shy of their first anniversary. Alexander Teves wanted to be a psychiatrist. A.J. Bowick wanted to be an art teacher. And Jessica Gowie wanted to be a journalist. The profession lost a good one, says her boyfriend, Jay Miloff.
She just had such an impact on this world, and I want her to still have that impact.
They all had dreams left unfinished, and now the goodbyes begin. Lee Cowan, CBS News, Denver.
And that's the CBS Evening News for tonight. For all of us at CBS News, all around the world, good night.